My name is Naomi Mercer. I'm 32 years old, and 4 years ago, my mother looked me dead in the eye and called my college graduation a failure's ceremony. Not a milestone, not an achievement, not the kind of day a parent shows up for. A failure's ceremony. I still remember how calm she sounded when she said it, like she was commenting on the weather instead of dismissing the hardest years of my life. I had worked for that degree without family money, without family support, and definitely without family pride. When the day came, I walked across that stage knowing exactly which seats would be empty. And they were. While I collected my diploma, my mother was hosting a perfectly curated afternoon, with champagne, flowers, and the kind of smiling photos people post when they want the world to believe their family is flawless. She ignored my graduation like it was beneath her, like I was beneath her. I told myself that day would be the last time I ever expected anything from them, and for a while, it was. Then everything changed. 4 years later, I built something of my own, sold it for more money than anyone in my family ever imagined I could touch, and suddenly, the same people who couldn't spare 3 hours for my graduation had time for me. Plenty of it. My phone lit up with a number I knew by heart. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. She said we needed to talk. She said there would be a family meeting tomorrow. I told her, too late, way too late. But I went anyway. Not because I wanted closure, not because I wanted an apology. I went because by then I knew something they never thought I'd find out. And what I carried into that meeting was a lot more dangerous than proof they had underestimated me. Before I tell you what happened when they realized the daughter they threw away was the one person who could ruin everything, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, because this story only gets worse from here. I was 7 when they sent me away to live with my grandmother in coastal Maine. No screaming fight, no dramatic confession, no explanation a child could actually understand. Just suitcases packed too neatly, a car ride that felt too quiet, and one polished sentence about how it would be better for everyone if I stayed with Grandma for a while. A while turned into years. Back then, my family lived in one of those old Boston houses that looked beautiful from the outside and emotionally refrigerated on the inside. Everything was curated. The right schools, the right dinner parties, the right family friends, the right smiles in the right photographs. My younger sister fit into that world like she had been designed for it. She had my mother's face, my mother's softness, my mother's place in every frame. I did not. I had my father's eyes, his jaw, his dark hair, and apparently, though I would not understand this until much later, I also had the power to make my mother visibly uncomfortable just by existing in the same room. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, never poisoned me against them. She never had to. She simply loved me so completely that the difference between real love and polite neglect became impossible to miss. She packed my lunches, helped me with homework, sat through every school recital, and clapped like I was performing at Carnegie Hall, even when I was just one nervous girl in the back row of a winter choir concert. While my family in Boston built a life without me, Grandma built one around me. I learned early that if I wanted anything, I would have to earn it myself. By 16, I was working weekends, applying for scholarships, and planning a future that did not depend on a single Mercer dollar. By 18, I had a full academic package and a one-way ticket toward a life my family did not help create. I studied data science and healthcare systems, then built my path the same way I built everything else, through discipline, stubbornness, and a private promise that no one would ever get to call me disposable again. My graduation should have been the moment they saw what I had done without them. Instead, it became one more humiliation I had to survive in public. I mailed the invitation months in advance. I followed up. I even lowered my expectations enough to hope for the bare minimum. A polite text. A bouquet. 2 people in the audience pretending to care. What I got was worse than silence because silence at least can leave room for doubt. My mother called and told me, in a cool voice that still makes my stomach turn when I remember it, that she did not believe in celebrating mediocrity disguised as ambition. Then she said the words I had already repeated to myself 1,000 times by then. Failure's ceremony. She called my graduation a failure's ceremony. I crossed that stage anyway. I graduated at the top of my program anyway, and when I looked into the audience, the only person standing for me, crying for me, proud of me, was my grandmother. Later that afternoon, while I was still holding my diploma and trying not to let the emptiness crack open in public, my mother posted photographs from a garden luncheon in Boston. Crystal glasses, summer roses, linen napkins, perfect lighting, perfect guests, perfect daughter. I saved the screenshots. I do not know why I did it then. Maybe because some part of me already understood that one day I would need proof that the cruelty had been real. Part of me thought that after graduation, I would finally stop wanting anything from them. And I almost did. I moved on. I worked. I built. I turned every ounce of rejection into momentum. But the thing about families like mine is that they always come back when success gives them something to claim. By 32, I had done more than build a career. I had built a company. What started as a small analytics platform designed to flag suspicious hospital billing patterns grew faster than I ever expected. Insurers wanted it. Compliance firms wanted it. Hospital networks that had once ignored my emails suddenly wanted meetings. Then a larger firm came in with an acquisition offer so aggressive I laughed the first time I read it. I negotiated, signed, and watched the numbers hit my account in stages so large they almost looked fictional. The trade press picked it up. My consulting calendar filled for the next year. I was making more money in a month than my family had once implied I never would see in a lifetime. 3 weeks before my mother called me with that sugary little invitation to a family meeting, my grandmother died. That sentence still feels wrong even now. She had been the only place in my life that ever felt steady. And when she was gone, the world became quieter in a way I hated. I stayed behind after the funeral to go through her house because I could not stand the idea of strangers boxing up the rooms that had held me together. In the back of her bedroom closet, tucked inside an old cedar chest beneath winter blankets and letters tied with ribbon, I found a thick envelope with my name in her handwriting. Inside was a photograph of my mother in her 20s, standing far too close to a man who was definitely not my father. There was a second item, a typed note from my grandmother warning me not to trust sudden kindness from family members who had spent decades proving I meant nothing to them. And there was a business card for a private investigator named Ethan Cross. On the back, in my grandmother's small, careful script, she had written, "If they come back, start here." They did come back. 48 hours after an article about my company exit circulated through business media, my mother called sounding almost tender. She had never sounded tender with me in my life. She asked how I was. She called me sweetheart. She said the family needed to reconnect and that tomorrow there would be a meeting at the house in Boston. The same house where my room had disappeared years ago, where every photograph on the walls had taught me exactly where I ranked. I said, too late. Way too late. Then I hung up. 10 minutes later, my father texted. The message was short, formal, and somehow even more insulting for how carefully neutral it tried to sound. It said they wanted to discuss honoring my grandmother's legacy, not apologize, not explain, honor her legacy. I already knew it was about money before I walked in. I just did not yet know how dirty the rest of it was. The next afternoon, I went back to Boston for the first time in months. The house looked even more polished than I remembered. New landscaping, new stonework, fresh paint. It was the kind of place that whispered stability even when it was built on lies. My mother greeted me like we were close. My father shook my hand like I was a donor he hoped not to lose. My sister, Camille Mercer, hugged me with the awkward caution of someone who knew she had always benefited from my exclusion, but had never once been forced to say it out loud. Lunch was laid out on the terrace as if we were having a civilized reunion instead of a negotiation staged by people who had never spent an honest day with me. Then my father opened a leather folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a fully designed proposal for something called the Mercer Legacy Foundation. According to them, it would honor my grandmother by supporting overlooked students from fractured homes. It used all the right language: opportunity, dignity, educational access, resilience. My grandmother would have loved the mission. That was the first thing that made me sick. Because even before I reached the numbers, even before I saw who was listed as executive director, I knew they were using her name as bait. Camille was on salary. My mother had a consulting stipend. 2 outside vendors were listed at rates high enough to make me narrow my eyes. The launch budget was bloated. The oversight structure was weak. And at the bottom of the final page was the number they wanted from me: $300,000 as a founding family contribution. My mother reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over mine like she had ever comforted me a day in her life. She said, "We know how successful you've become, Naomi. We thought this could finally bring us back together as a family." That was when I understood the real insult. They did not come back because they loved me. They came back because I had become useful. I smiled. I nodded. I told them I would review everything carefully. Then I drove back to Maine, pulled out the card my grandmother had left me, and called Ethan Cross before the sun went down. Ethan Cross did not waste words. He met me in Portland the next morning, looked through every document from the foundation proposal, and said, "If your instincts are already telling you this stinks, they're probably being conservative." That was the beginning. While Ethan started on the family side, I handled the financial side myself. The advantage of building a company around fraud detection is that after a while, you stop hearing excuses and start hearing patterns. The proposed foundation was registered legally, which meant they were not stupid enough to run something cartoonishly fake. That was almost worse. It had real paperwork, a real tax application in progress, a real bank account, branding, a launch timeline, and all the visual legitimacy money can buy. But when I started tracing the vendors, things bent in ways that should have been straight. A strategic consulting firm tied to an old friend of my mother's had no meaningful track record. A marketing agency had a polished site but no substantive portfolio, and an address that led to shared office space used by dozens of shell entities. Camille's compensation package was obscene for a foundation that had not yet helped a single living person. Every page looked clean until you understood what clean fraud actually looks like. It is never sloppy at the start. It is elegant, tax-aware, emotionally manipulative, and dressed in mission language. A week into the review, Ethan called and told me he had something I needed to see in person. I drove down and met him in his office, where he handed me a file with copies of archived photographs, an old gallery program, and a name that made everything in my grandmother's envelope start to breathe. Adrian Vale, the man in the photograph with my mother. He had been a well-known architectural photographer in Boston in the early 90s, magnetic, talented, financially unstable, and according to 2 people Ethan interviewed, deeply involved with my mother before her marriage. There had been rumors at the time. Nothing provable, nothing public. Just enough smoke to make my grandmother suspicious 30 years later. Ethan also found something else. My parents had not suddenly become interested in reconnecting because of sentiment. They were under pressure. The house had been refinanced twice. There was private debt. My father was nearing the end of a lucrative position with fewer options ahead than appearances suggested. The foundation was not just greed. It was a life raft they planned to fill with my money. Still, None of that explained why I had been sent away at 7 while Camille was adored in full daylight. That piece came next. I arranged private legal DNA testing through a lab that specialized in chain of custody collection. I gave my own sample voluntarily. Getting my father's was easier than it should have been. He had handed me a coffee mug during lunch the week before. And unlike my family, I had always paid attention when something mattered. Camille's sample took more effort. A preserved hairbrush from the family home, retrieved during a second visit after my mother insisted I stop by to discuss donor strategy. Adrian Vale's comparison sample came from a sealed forensic reference prepared before his death and held by an attorney Ethan located through estate filings. The waiting nearly broke my concentration. I kept working. I kept reviewing projected budgets and donor decks. I kept responding to my mother's suddenly affectionate texts with neutral one-sentence answers. And then the lab sent the results. I opened them alone in my grandmother's kitchen with both hands flat on the table, because something in me already knew the floor was about to shift. My father was my biological father. There was no ambiguity. Camille was not his biological daughter. Camille matched Adrian Vale. I read it 3 times. Then I sat there in total silence, while every memory I had ever tried to explain with simple favoritism rearranged itself into something uglier and more precise. My mother had not rejected me because I disappointed her. She rejected me because I was proof of the life she had actually chosen. My father had not failed to protect me because he did not know better. He failed because he knew exactly what was happening and still chose the version of the family that kept his marriage and his image intact. Camille had been the treasured center of the household because she represented my mother's hidden loyalty, the life she had loved before the marriage she performed. And I had been sent away the moment I started looking too much like the man who made the lie harder to hold together. When I was 7, I had asked a simple question over breakfast. Why do I look exactly like Dad, but Camille doesn't look like either of you? I remembered the way my mother's face changed. I remembered how quiet the house was that night. I remembered my suitcase appearing the next morning. For years, I thought that memory was too dramatic to trust. Now it made perfect sense. I was not removed because I was difficult. I was removed because I was observant. At the same time, the foundation evidence kept getting worse. I found inflated projections, pre-approval language for board governance that would have allowed spending discretion to stay entirely inside the family, and personal outreach materials already drafted to present me as a founding force, whether I approved them or not. Then Ethan uncovered another thread. A small industry publication had been fed background material, painting me as cold, unstable, and greedy in anticipation of potential donor hesitation. My mother was building a backup story. If I refused to fund their scheme, they would tell the world I was a bitter daughter undermining a charitable effort created in my grandmother's name. That was the moment the whole thing crossed from insult into war. I refused the second meeting at first, so my mother escalated. She sent flowers to my house in Maine with a note about family healing. My father called to say he was worried I had misunderstood the foundation's purpose. Camille texted me late at night saying Grandma would have wanted us united. The emotional choreography was so deliberate, it almost would have been impressive if it were not so transparent. I told them I needed additional financial documentation before I released $1. My mother replied within 5 minutes asking why I was making everything difficult. Difficult. That word made me laugh out loud in my kitchen. Families like mine always call accountability difficult when what they really mean is inconvenient. I requested contracts, vendor breakdowns, salary justification, reimbursement policies, and draft bylaws reflecting actual independent oversight. What came back only made things worse. The documents were incomplete. Dates were inconsistent. Line items did not reconcile. The launch event expenses were already padded. And there were signs that donor interest had been overstated to pressure me into moving quickly. I told them I would not release any funds until an outside forensic review was complete. That was when the masks came off. My mother called me ungrateful. My father said I was embarrassing the family. Camille accused me of making everything about old wounds instead of the future. I recorded every call. I kept every email. I saved every voicemail. Then the article hit. It did not name me a criminal. People with money and social training are usually too polished for that. Instead, it framed me as a brilliant but volatile founder whose personal instability had complicated a family charitable initiative. It implied I had become obsessive over inheritance matters. It suggested my judgment might be compromised by unresolved resentment. It was just subtle enough to sound respectable and just vicious enough to do damage. Within 72 hours, 2 consulting conversations went cold. A healthcare system I had been advising asked to postpone contract finalization pending internal review. Another client quietly reduced my involvement on a compliance build-out worth nearly $2 million over the next year. No one said the article was the reason. No one had to. Reputation damage among wealthy professionals rarely arrives with a confession attached. It arrives as hesitation, distance, and a sudden loss of enthusiasm from people who were excited to know you last week. Then things got uglier. A set of emails began circulating, supposedly from an address that looked close enough to mine to mislead anyone glancing quickly. The messages implied that I had threatened to expose private family matters unless certain financial arrangements were made. The language was clumsy, melodramatic, and unlike anything I would ever write. But that did not matter at first. What mattered was that they existed long enough to be shown, forwarded, whispered about, and mentioned in conversations I was not in the room to correct. My attorney, Dana Whitlock, entered the picture after the second client issue and took one look at the materials and said, "This is no longer a family conflict. This is fraud, defamation, and fabricated evidence." Dana was exactly the kind of lawyer you want when people mistake your calm for weakness. Sharp, unsentimental, and almost offensively competent. She had me stop engaging directly unless necessary, route everything through preserved channels, and begin assembling a litigation file so thorough it could survive public scrutiny. While she worked the legal side, Ethan kept digging. The fake email domain had links to a service purchased through a third-party account connected to someone in my mother's orbit. A so-called public relations consultant who had worked with her on museum fundraising dinners had quietly placed background talking points with one small publication after another. My mother was not improvising. She was running a reputation containment strategy against her own daughter. The worst part was that it worked just enough to hurt. One of my larger contract renewals stalled. A board invitation vanished. A speaking appearance I had verbally agreed to was suddenly unavailable due to scheduling changes that fooled no one. The direct financial loss crossed $2 million in projected work within a month. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive back to Boston and throw the DNA report at all of them just to watch the room burn. But anger is expensive when the other side is hoping you become reckless. So I did the opposite. I got colder. I cataloged everything. Every article, every edited screenshot, every suspicious sender detail, every contradiction between their public charity language and their private financial behavior. Then Dana uncovered the mistake that would eventually break my mother wide open. In a filing prepared to threaten me with legal action, they attached copies of the fake emails as though they were authentic evidence of coercion. They did not just circulate lies privately. They submitted manipulated materials in a context where forensic review could destroy them. My mother, in her panic, had done what arrogant people often do when they have been winning too long. She assumed her performance would hold up under examination. She forgot who she was dealing with. I had built my entire adult life around examining what other people hoped no one would look at closely. By then, I had lost money, contracts, and the last scrap of illusion that any part of my family conflict could still be resolved quietly. That ended the final hesitation inside me. I told Dana to file everything. Not part of it. Not the soft version. Everything. The pre-trial hearing took place on a gray morning in Boston, though by the time I walked into the courthouse I felt strangely calm. Not peaceful. Not healed. Just finished with fear. My mother was there in navy silk, polished as ever, as if good tailoring might still save her. My father looked 20 years older than he had when I saw him at lunch on the terrace. Camille sat rigid between them, trying to look composed and failing every time she glanced at my side of the room and saw the binders stacked in front of Dana. The hearing was supposed to focus on civil claims. Foundation misuse, defamation, financial harm. Instead, it became the day their entire mythology cracked in public. Dana started with the money because money is where people like my parents always imagine they are safest. She laid out the foundation structure, the personal compensation, the vendor relationships, the consulting payments to insiders, the pre-launch spending with no charitable output, and the false representation used to leverage my name and reputation. The judge asked simple questions in a tone so quiet it made the answers sound even weaker. How many scholarships had been awarded? None. How many beneficiaries had been served? None. Why had executive compensation begun before programming existed? No coherent answer. Why had a family member's business acquaintance received a strategic consulting retainer far above standard startup nonprofit rates? Again, no coherent answer. My mother's attorney tried to frame it as mismanagement during a rushed launch. Then Dana moved to the forged communications. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to. She submitted metadata reports, domain registration paths, server traces, timing overlaps, language pattern comparisons, and a digital forensics summary, linking the manufactured emails to accounts and devices that had originated from within the orbit of my mother's own operation. The courtroom went so still I could hear someone shifting papers 3 rows back. My mother's face changed then, not into shame, into panic. Real panic, the kind that makes people blink too much and hold their jaw too hard because they can feel control leaving their body in real time. The judge asked whether the defense wished to contest the authenticity analysis. Their attorney requested a brief pause. He already knew he was standing on a collapsing floor, but Dana was not done. She asked permission to introduce evidence relevant to motive, pattern, and long-standing family deception directly tied to the present fraud. The judge allowed it. That was when the DNA reports entered the record. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can still see exactly how each person reacted. My father did not look surprised. He looked defeated. That was somehow worse. My mother looked like she had been physically struck. Camille stared at the projected page for a full second too long before her whole body went rigid. Dana read the summary cleanly. I was Charles Mercer's biological daughter. Camille Mercer was not. Camille matched Adrian Vale, the former partner my mother had buried under 30 years of social performance. No one spoke at first. Then Camille turned to my father so slowly it felt unreal and asked one question in a voice I barely recognized. You knew. It was not really a question. My father lowered his eyes and gave the smallest nod I have ever seen destroy another human being. Camille looked at my mother next. The expression on her face was not just rage. It was collapse. Identity is a strange thing. People think it lives in records and blood and names. What I watched leave my sister's face that day was not just certainty about her father. It was certainty about her whole life. My mother tried to interrupt then. She said the test was irrelevant. She said it was an attack on the family. She said I had no right. Dana cut in and reminded the court that the defense had already presented fabricated communications in connection with their position. that the foundation fraud and the defamation campaign were plainly tied to a decades-long pattern of concealment and manipulation, and that motive mattered. The judge agreed. Then the final blow landed. Because in trying to support the extortion story, my mother had used forged materials in a court context where authenticity was legally material. The judge referred the matter for criminal review on the spot and requested the district attorney be notified regarding possible false reporting and fraudulent submission of evidence. My mother's attorney asked for time. The judge gave him almost none. By then, the hearing had moved beyond whether the foundation had been badly run. It had become a question of intentional deceit. Camille walked out before anyone could stop her. My father remained seated like a man who had finally discovered that cowardice compounds interest. My mother stood to object again, but her voice shook so badly that even she seemed to hear what it sounded like. There is a moment when certain people realize that charm will not work anymore. I watched that realization happen in my mother's face while 2 officers approached after the hearing to speak with counsel about the referral. She was not dragged away screaming. Reality is often crueler than that. She simply lost altitude all at once. The poise, the certainty, the social polish, the lifelong confidence that she could rearrange the truth by performing over it. Gone. My father tried to come toward me in the hallway. I did not let him. Camille was nowhere to be seen. Dana stood beside me, reviewed the next steps in a voice so practical it kept me from drifting into shock, and said the words I had waited years to hear in one form or another. They cannot control this anymore. She was right. For the first time in my life, they could not rewrite what happened. They could not exclude me from the room where the truth was spoken. They could not make me the difficult daughter, the unstable founder, the bitter outsider, the family problem. They had built a lie so carefully that they forgot one thing. Lies collapse hardest when the person forced to live underneath them finally stops protecting everyone else from the sound. In the months that followed, consequences arrived the way they always do in wealthy families, not all at once, but relentlessly. My mother took a plea once the forensic case became impossible to outrun. Between the fraudulent foundation activity, the false reporting, and the use of fabricated materials in the legal process, her lawyers negotiated hard and still failed to save her from the one thing she had spent her entire life believing happened only to other people. Public disgrace with legal permanence. She was sentenced to 5 years. My father retired early before the board at his firm could make the decision for him. The official statement said he was stepping away to focus on personal matters, which was the sort of bloodless language institutions use when everyone knows scandal is the real cause, but no one wants to say it with nouns. The social world they had built over decades evaporated faster than I thought even they deserved. Invitations stopped. Committee seats disappeared. People who had once praised my mother's elegance and my father's judgment developed sudden loyalty to distance. That part did not surprise me. Circles built on image never punish corruption because it is immoral. They punish it because it is embarrassing. Camille disappeared for a while. When I finally heard where she had gone, it was through Dana, who heard it through one of the many legal channels that begin opening when families start dividing themselves in public. She had left Massachusetts, stopped using Mercer socially, and rented a small apartment in Portland under the name Camille Vale. I did not know what I felt when I heard that. Pity, maybe. Anger. Still. Recognition, too. She had spent her whole life occupying the place I was denied, but she had also been built out of the same dishonesty that had hollowed out the rest of the family. We were not equal victims. I will never lie and pretend that. But she was not untouched by what our parents had done either. My father reached out once after the hearing and told me there had always been a trust in my name funded years earlier. $1.2 million. Protected. Untouched. Waiting. I listened in silence while he tried, in the language of late regret, to offer it as proof that he had loved me in the only cowardly way he knew how. I did not yell. By that point, rage had become too obvious a gift to hand him. I simply told him the truth. Money hidden for decades is not the same thing as showing up. Then I hung up. When the trust matured and the settlement funds cleared, I made the first decision that actually felt clean. I turned my grandmother's name into something no one in my family could poison. I founded the Margaret Hale Foundation and structured it the way the Mercer Legacy Foundation had only pretended to be structured. Independent board, transparent governance, outside auditing, no family appointments, no vanity salaries, no emotional manipulation disguised as mission. We funded full-ride scholarships for students from fractured families, children who were brilliant but overlooked, high-achieving but unsupported, the kinds of kids who had learned too early that love and reliability are not synonyms. I added a mental health stipend to every award because education changes a future. But healing changes the person who has to live inside it. Building the foundation did not erase anything, but it gave my anger a direction that did not rot me from the inside. I also built something else, though it took longer and mattered more. A chosen family. My therapist became one of the first safe witnesses to my life, someone who never once asked me to be more forgiving than honest. A few friends became people I could call without first editing myself into something easier to carry. Volunteers, board members, and later some of our scholarship students became reminders that connection feels very different when nobody is measuring your worth against what you can do for them. That was the strangest part of healing. Not the absence of pain, the absence of performance. I no longer had to be exceptional to earn a seat. I no longer had to succeed loudly enough to be noticed. I no longer had to wonder whether being loved would be revoked the second I became inconvenient. A year after the hearing, my mother was in prison. My father was alone in a smaller house, with his reputation stripped down to what was left after Image stopped doing the work, and Camille was rebuilding herself with a new last name and a life none of us had been raised to respect. As for me, I was living in coastal Maine in the house where my grandmother had taught me what being chosen looked like. Some nights I still sat in her kitchen and thought about the little girl I had been at 7, trying to understand why a simple question about faces had changed her entire life. I wish I could tell her earlier. I wish I could tell her that the adults around her were not powerful because they were right. They were powerful because she was small, and they were willing to use that against her. I wish I could tell her that one day she would stop confusing their rejection with her value. That may be the most important thing I learned through all of this. Family is not the people who share your blood and then weaponize your silence. Family is the people who show up without asking whether you have become successful enough to deserve tenderness. Your worth is not created by parental approval. It never was. Parents can fail their children completely and still remain parents on paper. That does not make them right. It does not make the child hard to love. It makes the parents limited, damaged, selfish, frightened, or morally weak. The truth did not just expose my family. It freed me from the story they had assigned me inside it. For years, I was the daughter they ignored, the one sent away. The one who was supposed to accept that exclusion quietly and then be grateful when they circled back for access to my success. But the truth changed the geometry of everything. I was not the unwanted daughter. I was the inconvenient witness. I was the proof they could not keep in the house without risking what they had built. And once I understood that, shame stopped sticking to me the way they had always intended it to. That is the educational lesson buried inside every revenge story people like to reduce to drama. Silence protects the architecture of abuse. Truth rearranges it. Accountability is not cruelty. Boundaries are not bitterness. Walking away from people who failed you repeatedly is not selfishness. It is sometimes the first honest act of self-respect in a life built around surviving their dishonesty. And if you can do one better, If you can take what they tried to break in you and turn it into shelter for someone else, then that is not just revenge. That is transformation. That is how you make sure the pain stops with you instead of becoming inheritance. I never got the graduation day I deserved. I never got parents who looked at me with uncomplicated pride. I never got a childhood untouched by comparison, secrecy, and emotional exile. But I did get this. I got the truth. I got my name back on my own terms. I got a life that no longer bends around waiting to be chosen by people who already made their decision. And I got to build something my grandmother would have recognized immediately as real love help that arrives without humiliation, support that does not require performance, and proof for overlooked children that somebody sees them before the world teaches them to disappear. That, in the end, mattered more than watching my mother lose her freedom or my father lose his standing, though I would be lying if I said those consequences were not deserved. The most satisfying ending was not their collapse. It was my refusal to collapse with them. It was becoming the safe place I once needed. It was learning that being invisible in your own home is not a verdict on your lovability. It is a verdict on the people who made a child earn what should have been given freely. And if you have ever felt that kind of invisibility, if you have ever been treated like your pain was inconvenient, or your success was only interesting once it became useful to someone else, I want you to hear this clearly. Their inability to love you correctly was never proof that you were unworthy. It was always proof of their limitation. You do not owe them your silence. You do not owe them your future. What you owe yourself is the life your younger self would have felt safe inside,